Hey, what's up? Today we're going to be talking about the Canon R3. I've had this camera about a month now, maybe a little more actually. Waiting on my second one still, but at least I got my first one, and I've been diving into the settings, and this camera is so complicated I didn't just make a settings video right away. Even though I've owned the R5, which I still have, and 1DX Mark IIIs and 2s and 1s and everything in between, this camera's a little bit different. It took me a little while longer to get the settings kind of how I like them. And I think they might still change a lot from here, but this should give you a pretty good starting point on how to set up your camera. I've been using it for some portraits, news assignments a little bit, but I've shot several like NFL games, college football games, and then just taking it on trips. And I've really liked the way this is set up. Feels pretty comfortable, kind of a good mix between like the 1DX world and the R5 world. And I can probably talk about this camera quite a bit, so I won't dive too deep, but let's get in the menus, figure some things out, and go from there. Like always, I'm probably gonna do my own autofocus settings video, especially with this camera, because it's probably the most complex camera for autofocus settings I've ever owned. So our first menu is pretty obvious. This is kind of your image quality, JPEG quality. This is the compression applied to each image quality setting. You can kind of leave them at default. If you want it to be a better quality, you just click in there and you can move these up and down. And I'm just using the joystick to the left of the right of the LCD screen to make these adjustments. Image type size, use your front dial to change the top menu and the bottom dial to change the lower menu. L, M, S, 1, and 2 are the various actual pixel sizes. And that previous menu, again, is the compression of each JPEG size. And that was the top, you have RAW, and then a compressed RAW. And same idea, the actual file dimensions are the same, 24 megapixels, but the compressed RAW is just compressed. I always just use all of the full data, to each their own though. Cropping aspect ratio, this will actually apply like a crop to the file. So if you want to shoot in a square format or 4:3 or 16:9, you can do that here. 1.6 crop is actually kind of cool if you're shooting a lot of wildlife or birds or maybe in sports. And basically it's just like a teleconverter. It makes it into like using like an APS-C size sensor. You of course are losing resolution, and this is all of these settings are the same as if you were to change it in post and just crop. So kind of a strange setting to change on a daily basis, but you can do it. I really wish they had a 4:5 because I really like shooting 4:5 film, but also 4:5 aspect ratio is pretty cool for photography. Next menu is just your exposure compensation, or if you want to bracket, you can do it from here too. Exposure compensation basically adjusts the meter to make the photographs darker or lighter usually based on scenes. So if you're shooting stuff in a lot of dark environments, you'd put your exposure compensation a little bit darker. But if you're shooting like say in a snowy environment where everything's white and the meter wants to make that snow gray, you'd exposure comp higher to make everything, basically telling the meter, hey, this should be brighter. ISO speed settings, you can set your ISO speed in here, and you can also set the range. So if you wanted to, you could even go down to low 50. I generally don't touch much in this menu. Maybe sometimes I change the range, but not much. That being said, I actually will probably turn the auto all the way up, because why not? HDR shooting, I don't use personally. But this is where you could enable that. But this is kind of to get more dynamic range. I don't use that, so I'm not going to dive into it. HDR mode would be related to that setting. Auto lighting optimizer. This is basically applies to JPEG images. And it basically helps bring your dynamic range into more control. But as it says here, it's disabled in manual mode and bulb mode. So, those are manuals of mode I commonly use, so I'm going to skip it. Highlight tone priority. Again, this is kind of a JPEG setting to help control your highlight tones. I don't use it because I shoot RAW. So So this is a big thing that changed in this camera is anti-flicker shooting. In the previous cameras, all before this, they had this anti-flicker shooting, the top menu item here. And it will basically, I think, try to time your frames with when the flicker isn't happening. High frequency anti-flicker shooting, this second menu item, is totally new and totally crazy, and pretty neat. So in high frequency anti-flicker shooting, this is a mouthful. What the camera is basically doing is you can have it read a scene for if the lights are flickering and at what frequency. You do this by keeping your camera still, pointing it at the environment in which you're taking a picture. So this could be a stage, this could be, a blank wall or a wedding venue, whatever it is. And it'll basically then adjust your shutter speed to try to compensate for that. I'm using video lights, so I don't have any flickering lights in here to do it. I'd love to do a video on it though, so I should probably do that. But it's pretty neat, but you have to have the camera steady and it will read the scene. It's really, really neat. But anyways, so obviously most of the time I have it off. But if you're shooting in a venue that has like sodium vapor lighting or those constant fluorescent tubes, I'm trying to think of like the worst offenders, or maybe a video screen, you can enable this and it'll go to these really weird shutter speeds basically to overcompensate that flicker. External speed light control, I don't really change much in here. I generally don't use an on-camera flash, and when I use flashes, I'm using like pro photo lights to do portraits or studio work, which I'm doing later today. So, but I don't really touch much in here because this is more related to like an on-camera speed light. Speaking of flashes, if you are planning to use studio photography for this, I have found that you have to have the camera set to mechanical shutter when you're using strobes. So my ProPhoto lights do work. I don't have one handy, but my ProPhoto flash and everything works with this camera, but I have to be in mechanical shutter, not electronic shutter. Metering mode, I like evaluative. Partial metering, spot metering, and center weighted average are all other options. Whatever you're comfortable with. I'm sure people have different arguments for each one. Evaluative is going to evaluate the whole entire frame. Spot is going to meter right in the center, or you can change it to tie to where your autofocus point is. Personally, I like evaluative. It's just the way I've worked for 15 years now. So white balance is very obvious. You can change your white balance to whatever you need it to be. Custom white balance, this is where you would take an image of a calibrated gray card and you could load it in and set a custom white balance that way. This has been on Canon cameras forever. White balance shift, you could shift, more green, more magenta, amber, blue, whatever. Just basically you can manually fudge around your white balance. Color space, I have it set to Adobe RGB. That's going to be more color information for JPEG files. sRGB is more of like a web color set, or a less robust set of colors. And again, this doesn't really apply to RAW, so it's not really a big setting to change if you're shooting RAW. But if you are shooting JPEGs, Adobe's going to give you more color information. Picture style, again, since I shoot RAW, I just kind of leave this alone. If you want to change it to something else, you can here, or load in custom ones through the Canon software on the computer. But generally, I just leave it in standard. Again, clarity also applies to JPEG files. Clarity, you're probably familiar from the computer, is kind of like the mid-tone contrast. So if you have your whitest white and your blackest black in a frame, which right now is probably my cheek and my sweatshirt, that's kind of contrast. Clarity would be more the difference between my shirt that's probably a little bit grayish because of the lighting, and like my cheek. So more like the mid-tone. That's probably not a very accurate description, but it's more like mid-tone separation. I leave it alone because I'm shooting RAW. Lens aberration correction. This data might pull over to the RAW files. I haven't actually tried to turn it off and see if the RAW files still read it. But basically this is going to help fix vignetting, distortion, stuff like that. And again, this is applying to your JPEG files. And like I said, it might apply to the RAWs, but I don't think it does. Long exposure noise reduction. This is basically noise reduction applied if you're doing long exposures. Think astrophotography or like landscapes or stuff like that, where you're keeping your shutter open for a very long time. High ISO speed noise reduction. Exactly what it sounds like when using high ISO speeds. This is the amount of noise reduction applied to those files. I don't shoot JPEG, so this would be applied to the JPEGs. Me personally, I would recommend low or medium if you are shooting JPEGs, because once you start going too far, it's just going to start throwing away details. So that's my own opinion. But dust delete data is for basically you can load in to try to figure out where dust is on your sensor if you're doing a sensor cleaning. So not a setting you use commonly. Multi-exposure and focus bracketing. Multiple exposures when you take a series of pictures and layer them on top of each other. This is something you'd kind of dive into to do that creative effect. Day to day, I don't really use it. If you were to enable it, you can dive in here and do what you want. But basically, the additive, average, bright, or dark, this is like how the photographs are mixed together. Whether you're just like taking, if this is gray and another thing on top of it goes gray, do you average the two grays out, or do you take this gray and add more light to it to then make it like brighter? That'd be an example of how these work. And then you can set the number of exposures if you save the original images, stuff like that. Focus bracketing I haven't used, but basically when doing macro photography or still life photography or other things where it's hard to achieve all the depth of field you need, you could go in here and it would basically walk the camera through multiple focus points, and then you merge them together in post. And it might actually merge them in the camera for you. I don't actually know, because I don't do a lot of still life photography. But yeah, basically this is for that kind of stuff. You'd obviously have to be using a tripod and shooting something that doesn't move. So again, this is really mostly for still life photography or macro photography, stuff like that. Drive mode. So this is kind of interesting. This is actually one of my things I don't like about this camera. So you have the ways you'd expect to see: single shot, meaning it takes one photo for every press of the button. High speed continuous plus, which means that it's maximum speed. High speed continuous, which is, anyways, hold on. And then low speed continuous. And then of course I have disabled, but you then have timer, like, for taking a picture of yourself and putting a timer, but I disable those because I wouldn't use them. So single shooting is exactly what it sounds like. That's a single photograph per button press. The reason there isn't a number attached to the high speed continuous, high speed, and low speed continuous is because they would be dependent on whether or not you're in electronic or mechanical shutter mode. In electronic, which is what I would recommend using with this camera virtually all of the time, high speed continuous plus is that 30 frames per second. High speed continuous is, I believe, 15 frames per second, and low speed is either 3 or 5. It's pretty slow. So my problem is there's no way to slide between them. There's no way to say, well, I don't really need 30. Maybe I want to be at like 25 or 20 as an example. I'm hoping this comes with a firmware update, but as of right now, you got to either choose 15 or 30. And that's a pretty big gap. For me, 15 is plenty for everything I've shot so far, which has included NFL games. But I could see wanting to go to 20 or so. High speed plus the 30 frames per second would probably be pretty good for like hockey or maybe shooting sports like archery or skeet and stuff like that. So I could see going to 30 sometimes, but most of the time I kind of maybe want to be in that 16 to 20 range day to day. And as of right now, you can't do that. Interval timer, this would be for making like time-lapse photography. Silent shutter function, you would think I would have this on basically at all times, but I'll actually show you why I leave this off in just a second. This is a simple way to set it to being a silent shutter, but I always leave it on off even when I need this shutter to be silent, and I'll show you that in the yellow menus in just a second. Shutter mode, This is again like the R5 and R6 and all the mirrorless R bodies. I pretty much exclusively use this in electronic shutter. I haven't had an issue with any problems. This is a new world compared to the R6 and R5 where you could get some warping and warbly images. I'm using electronic 99% of the time. The one time I'm going to mechanical so far is when I use strobes. So yeah, using strobes, portrait photography with studio lighting, or using a flash, you do have to go to mechanical, but I leave it on electronic. Release shutter without card, pretty self-explanatory, but basically the camera will or will not take a picture if there's no memory card in it. I always turn this off. And if you rent a camera, make sure to turn it off because I don't want to start taking pictures and then not realize I don't have a memory card in the camera. Yes, I know the message comes up, but it's happened. Image stabilizer mode, on or off in here. I think I generally just leave it off. I generally shoot at higher shutter speeds. For me, I don't know. That's just the way I see it. I could see it introducing artifacting of some sort. I've never had it happen, but it seems more possible with it on, so I just leave it off. Customize quick controls. This would be for like your kind of what's on your back screen when you hit this Q button on the back. So you can adjust these as needed. So those are very per person specific, so I don't really dive into them. The defaults are generally fine for me. I'm sure there's stuff I could add or take away depending on what I'm doing, but anyways. Touch shutter I turn off. That's basically like the ability to touch the back screen and have it take a picture. I would never want that, so I keep it off. Image review I also have set to off. This is basically the photograph automatically popping up on the back screen. Hold would mean that it just stays on until you do something. 8 seconds, 4 seconds, and 2 seconds means it pops up for either 8, 4, or 2 seconds. Personally, I hate the back screen blinking or plopping up, so I always have set this to off. And then viewfinder display, I think, would turn it off or on. If you were taking pictures, it would, do you want the image to pop up in your eyeball? Which obviously I would also disable. Metering timer, I don't change. I don't think I've ever changed the metering timer on a camera, but I think this is basically how much time it would continue to meter without you like activating it again. Not something I've ever had an issue with it being at the default setting. Display simulation and OVF sim view assist are probably more complicated than they appear. I actually read up on this yesterday and kind of got a little bit lost. So basically display simulation, which is 9, top thing in 9, this would be when you're looking at the screen, do you want to see exposure plus depth of field, meaning that it would not only show you the proper exposure through your viewfinder or screen, but it would also show you the anticipated depth of field. So it would stop the lens down to say f11 or f5.6. Generally when a camera is operating, the aperture stays wide open. And when you take the picture, the aperture closes down and then opens back up. So exposure plus depth of field would be, you'd see an f5.6 or f11. And if you're using a lot of stuff that's, fairly closed down, that might be pretty convenient. Exposure only during depth of field. Exposure would obviously be that it just simulates the exposure without adjusting the aperture so it stays wide open, but it, will look like what it's going to look like. And exposure only during depth of field preview, I think would mean that it would not simulate the exposure until you hold down the depth of field preview button. And then disable would be more like using a traditional camera or a camera with an optical viewfinder, that when you pull the camera up to your eye, it's just kind of giving you an average exposure regardless of your camera settings. So if you're used to an optical viewfinder and you don't like that when you put the camera up, it's, showing you a really dark image, then you would want to disable it. So far, I've been using exposure sim, and that's why I use them on R5 too, and it's pretty good. I don't have too many problems with that. I could see using it in disable if you do a lot of studio work. If you're doing a lot of studio photography, then a lot of times the studio is pretty dark and then the strobes go off and it's very bright. So maybe your exposure is 1/160th at f11 at ISO 100, but the room is, you know, pretty dim, then that'd be a problem. Optical viewfinder simulation view assist. So I think this would be, this camera's complicated. So this would simulate what an optical viewfinder would be like. So I think you have to disable the other exposure assist and then turn this one on, if I'm correct. I have not tried this setting. I literally was just reading a document about it last night and did not get to test it. But yeah, so these are kind of how the photo, this is how the photo is shown to you while taking pictures versus unrelated or related to the exposure you have set. Optical viewfinder sim assist, shooting info display. So this is just basically like what information you're gonna see while you're in your viewfinder and stuff like that. So you can go in here and kind of edit these screens and what shows up and stuff like that. The viewfinder display format, someone actually commented on my other video what this does. Evidently display 2 is if you have glasses. I did not know that. So display 1, it's going to spread out over the whole entire, use the most amount of space. And then display 2 is a little bit smaller, so if you have glasses, you're not trying to, like, you know, see into those corners as much. I use display 1 and I normally have glasses on. I'm switching to contacts lately, but that works okay for me. But if you're, you know, harder of seeing or maybe at different glasses, display 2 might be able, so you can see the corners a little better. Display performance. So this is also related to the electronic viewfinder. So power saving is going to be like 60 frames per second, and I think smooth is more like 120 frames per second. I've been shooting sports and all kinds of stuff with power saving and haven't noticed an issue. I actually thought I had it set to smooth before I made this video. And then inside of smooth, there's an option here if you hit the info button for suppress lower frame rate. And I think that means it basically forces it to be at that higher frame rate instead of being able to drop down, which I think could affect like the way the camera behaves in lower light. But yeah, so far I've been having good luck with power savings. I guess smooth might be a little bit faster. I haven't had like I said, I thought I had it on smooth, so I guess power savings okay for me. And yeah. So autofocus, I think this deserves its own video, but I'm basically using the way the camera was out of the box, more or less. I always use a back button autofocus settings, meaning that my focus is not activated by my shutter button, but instead autofocus is activated by a back button, you know, like the AF on or asterisk button and stuff back on the back side of the camera. So with that being said, I'm going to use AF as servo mode always. AF area, you can set this just like any other camera. I personally like to use either the 1-point autofocus, the spot autofocus, or the expand AF area. I have great luck with all of those. Generally, I'm using expand AF area or even the expand AF area around. But this new camera works different than old cameras, so I actually have been really liking this. Subject tracking is interesting. I have it set to on, meaning that basically if it sees the thing you have it set to detect, it's going to start like tracking that thing inside of the frame. So I have it set to on, and then I have it set to people, because most of what I do is photographing people. You can set to people, animals, vehicles for like motorsports, or none. So any of them. And I would assume most people want it on people or animals. So in addition to leaving the subject tracking on, I also leave the eye detect on. You could disable it if you wanted to, but if you're going to try to detect animals or anything, I always like to have it focus on an eye, so why not leave it on? So switching track subjects, This allows you to basically set how quickly the camera could switch to a new subject. I've had good luck so far with just the default setting, but I could maybe see turning it down if anything. But yeah, I've had pretty good luck so far with just leaving it on 1. So far, just like the 1DX3 and the 1DX2 and R5 and all that, I've been using 2 with pretty good luck. This has been great for shooting football, portraits and all that. It's certainly awesome. But yeah, I've been having pretty good luck with just leaving this in servo mode 2. These are like the other cameras, pretty similar, obviously. So as I usually say in most of my videos, I'm generally working between 2 and 4. For most stuff I do so far, 2 has been pretty great. This is for one-shot autofocus. So basically, if you are using one-shot autofocus, if it's set to focus, so make sure the camera is focused before you hit the shutter button. If it's set to release, then it'll fire when you hit the shutter button or push the shutter button all the way down, versus waiting for the camera to be in focus. Preview of autofocus, I actually don't know what this is. I have no clue, so I am going to leave it disabled, but I don't know what that would mean. Lens drive when autofocus is impossible. What this basically means is if a camera cannot focus, it will either continue to go back and forth and try to focus, or it will just stop trying to focus. I usually leave it on because I'm in control with that back button anyways. So I just, can just take my thumb off the back button if I see that it's stuck trying to figure something out. Autofocus assist beam firing. For this particular camera, it's when you're using a flash, and basically it would fire off that infrared autofocus assist beam, that red light that comes out of the front. I leave it on because it's rare I use a flash, but if I do, that's obviously helpful. You can limit the autofocus areas that you can select from if you want to. On this camera so far, I've left them all enabled, but right in here you could uncheck the ones you don't want, and then hit OK to save that selection. Autofocus area selection control. Basically this, behind the shutter button here, there's a little grid button that is that button indicated on the left side. And after hitting that, you can either hit the MFN button by the shutter button, or you can hit that front control dial by the shutter button to choose between these autofocus areas while you're inside the viewfinder. I do switch it to the main dial. I used to always use the MFN button, but this is way quicker. So I hit that back button and then I turn the dial and change my mode. Autofocus point select sensitivity. This is basically how fast or slow the autofocus point moves when you grab the joystick. Again, default's been pretty good for me, but you can make it faster or slower. Orientation linked autofocus point. I leave it for same for both vertical and horizontal. And you could change it so it would be different based on if you're using a camera vertically or horizontally. And then that could either be that if you use the middle one, then it can be a different whole setup. So maybe when you turn it vertical, you want it to be a spot focus, and then when you turn the camera horizontally, you want it to be expand. That would be the middle one. The bottom one would use the same autofocus setup, like that, grid or whatever, or point, and then just the point, then the point would be different. I leave it the same for both. I've tried all of them. For me personally, leaving it the same works better for me. I'm kind of doing all the autofocus settings, so maybe I don't need a separate video. Manual focus peaking settings. If you are using manual focus, this will highlight the things in or out of focus with a red area or whatever color you choose. I turn this on when you're not using manual focus, and none of this comes up, so it doesn't distract you. But it does make manual focusing a lot easier when using, say, a vintage lens like this, TT Artisans 51.4 I have for the RF mount. So it makes it a lot easier to use something like that and get that accurate focus a lot easier. Focus guide, same idea. This is basically to help you get more accurate autofocus. And this basically shows these two triangles that crisscross and then it helps you know if your camera's in focus or not. Again, I leave it on because if you are manual focusing, everything helps it be a little bit better. Electronic full-time manual focus, this basically means that no matter what, the lenses that have electronic manual focus will be able to be manual focus at all times. I have it set to off because I don't really have a good answer why. I don't want to accidentally bump it in manual focus, so I have to tape down all my new lenses. Electronic model focus, you could actually change, see if it's one shot enabled, disable in autofocus mode, lots of different things here. So basically that's what you're changing. With the RF lenses, you can now change your focus ring rotation. So basically, if you want to focus like a Nikon, where it's, you know, backwards from Canon and a bunch of other people, you could do that. One thing I do change here is the lens manual focus ring sensitivity. I have it linked so it feels more like a traditional lens, where it's like, I'm going to change it from this to this. It's going to be the same amount of manual focus. This top setting is the default, and that basically means that if you're moving it slower or faster, it will be able to tell, oh, they want to make a bigger jump or they want to make a smaller jump. So if you're into fine tuning, maybe the top section is better. I'm just used to old lenses and how you would manual focus like a cinema lens or an old photo lens. And I just want it to be kind of more linked to what it would be no matter what. I don't change much in the blue menus. The only thing I really change is in menu 4, and that is going to be this image jump with control dial, which is the front dial. So this top setting here, and I change it to this setting here with the key. So what this means is that if I were to protect a photo or tag a photo, as people use both terms, this way when I'm in playback looking at photos on the back of my camera, if I grab that front dial, it's going to jump from tagged photo to tagged photo to tagged photo, rather than, and it just makes review and tagging and everything a lot quicker. And then you can still use the back dial to go in through the photos one by one. But then that front dial will say like, hey, what photos did I tag today? I can just flip through really quickly. You could also set it to stars if you like using stars, or, you know, I think, yeah, basically a bunch of different ones here. And then the other one I change, or the way I have it set up, is the rate button. And I have it to do the key, which is protect or tag. And that if you're using Photo Mechanic, they come in with that little tagged mark, which is why I use it. And then if you hold it, it will record a memo. Currently, with this camera's current firmware, once you protect a photo, you can't record a memo. And that's the way it's been forever. But the 1DX Mark III just got new firmware, and I'm hoping this does too, and the R5, that even if a photo is protected, you can hold it down and then record a memo. So if you're watching this when this comes out, if you protect a photo, you then can't record a memo. You have to unprotect it, record the memo, and then hit it again to protect it again. It's pretty frustrating, but like I said, it looks like they're finally changing it. Memo auto quality, I leave it 48 kilohertz. I actually tried the 8 kilohertz option, and it sounded terrible. I don't change anything in these, but if you want to, you can enable like showing where your autofocus point was, or showing if you're clipping, if like, you know, something's totally white in your photograph, you can add that information in this menu 5. Network settings, I am not going to dive into, but basically you would use this to connect to, you know, wireless networks or Ethernet networks, and you can set up servers to then upload photos with FTP. I do this. I've used it at a football game already. It's fantastic. It transfers extremely quick. It's absolutely amazing, actually. The yellow menus, I'm not going to change much. You could customize your file name in here if you want to. Obviously, you can format your card, set your date and time. Not a lot of things I'm touching except for this in the second menu. So remember earlier when I said that I do not turn on silent shutter mode? So what I do is leave it on so it's not silent. Then over here in this volume menu, so yellow menu number 2, you can go in here and adjust the volume of your shutter. And you can hear it right now. So if you go to 0, there's no noise. And 1 is pretty quiet. So depending on the environment you're in, you might want it at 1 or 2. I've been leaving it at 2 generally, or I put it at 0. So when I'm doing something on a television set or anything where I have to be totally quiet, like a recording studio, I'm going to go to 0, and thus I get my totally silent shutter without having to manually dig through all the menus over and over. What's also nice is I turn the focus beep and the touch controls and all that stuff all the way down because I obviously don't want the camera doing this noise. That's the worst noise ever. There's not much I'm going to change in here. This is all probably defaults. Eye control, man. Eye control. Eye control I have off. I've had absolutely zero luck with this. I know there's probably a million people that want this camera for the eye control. If you wear contacts, if you wear soft contacts, I think specifically, it's gonna be a real pain. I tried setting up with glasses, I think twice, and had no luck at all. And I think I tried it with contacts once and also had no luck. Yeah, basically, you're not gonna see any eye control settings in this video because it just hasn't worked at all for me, is the short answer. Everything else is going to be pretty much default in all of these menus. Yeah, not much I'm going to be changing in here. Orange menu. This is what most people are pretty confused by. This first menu, I don't believe I changed anything at all. These are all default settings. The second menu, this first option here, same exposure for new aperture. What this basically means is if you're using a lens that has a variable aperture, like a 100 to 400 that goes from 4 to 5.6, or a 200 to 400 with the teleconverter, by turning this on, when you engage that teleconverter on the 200 to 400, or you zoom in a lens that the aperture is changing, it's basically going to adjust your ISO speed so your manual exposure stays the same. So if you set it to 1/200th at f4, and then you zoom in and the lens is physically a 5.6, it will go from, say, ISO 400 up to 800. Or if you engage that teleconverter, it's a setting that people don't use, and it's awesome. I love using this setting, and it was on the older cameras too. It's just kind of buried. Restrict shooting modes. This is where I turn off some of the shooting modes I'm not going to use. So I basically turn off, program, bulb, and I turn off some of the custom modes because I just don't use them that much. So I can always go back in here and turn them on, but generally day to day, I'm not using them for work. Shooting modes, or metering modes, I don't change. Shutter speed range and aperture range, I don't change. Restrict drive modes on menu 3. Again, I'm just leaving a lot of these things at default. Drive modes, I just turn off the self-timer. That's these self-timers, because again, I don't use them for work that much, but you can totally leave them on and just not ever set it to them, and that's the same thing. So the direction for TV and AV, I don't touch. Customizing buttons, I'll get into in a second. Customizing dials, I do change these. So I have my front control dial set to aperture. So when I'm in manual mode, it controls my aperture, which is backwards. Most people, it's the other way around. I like doing it this way because when I use aperture priority, it's the aperture. And I go to manual mode, it's also the aperture, which is nice. And obviously then the back dial is set to my shutter speed. So it just more similarly acts in manual mode like it would in aperture priority mode, which is all I really want out of it. So customize buttons is where everybody gets confused and lost on this setting up a camera, I think. So again, I'm setting up back button autofocus. So this is pretty similar to how I've set up every other Canon camera. But my shutter button is going to be either metering start or AE lock. So I use AE lock because I prefer to have the ability to, if I'm using aperture priority or something like that, or auto ISO, I can kind of manipulate the camera and then lock my exposure and then fire. Some people don't like that and they use metering start, which basically does nothing then except take the picture. So personally, I like it with lock. This is the first time ever I feel like this camera is missing like a button or two. And on the top of this camera, they took away like the 1DX style buttons, like the ISO, the light, you know, all those buttons that were up in front of this display. They took them away, and it's kind of driven me nuts. So for the first time ever, I'm repurposing the record button to be white balance. There's not really a quick way other than going to the LCD screen and finding a way to get to white balance, which isn't a big deal, but for me personally, it's slow. So I changed this to white balance instead of record. And that's mainly because I don't know, I mean, I'm not using this for video, but I'd switch it to video and then I can use it as record still. MFN is this button up by the shutter button. And basically with that, by default, and what I've left it on is called dial function, which I can actually show you here. You hit it and it basically brings up this quick menu that the back button goes left or right. And then this front dial controls, you know, the setting. So you can change, you know, your frame rate, your autofocus, your white balance. And this seems good enough, but like, again, right here, it's like I can go into Kelvin, but I can't change what Kelvin is, which I use a lot. But anyways, so maybe you keep that record button set the way it is, and you don't need, and then this button could be something else, or you can use that. Regardless, dial function's been pretty useful to me, and I've liked having it there. The front manual function button I have set to unlock, and what that basically means is a lot of times with all my cameras when I'm using them, I'm usually using more than one camera. They're bouncing around, moving around a lot. So I usually, on the back where you turn the camera on, you can, instead of going all the way on, you go halfway and it says lock. And so that'll lock dials, it'll lock, you know, basically locks in your, you can lock in your exposure, your dials, all that stuff. So 90% of the time, I actually use my camera locked. So I can't accidentally change my exposure and I go reach for another camera and now it's too bright, too dark, wrong aperture, whatever. So this front button, I have it set that you basically can hold that down and it overrides the lock, so then you can adjust your dials while holding it down. Pretty useful. The light button on the top I have so far left as a light button because sometimes you got to see that screen. I could easily see changing this to something else. Maybe if I could get eye autofocus, this is where I would enable it. But so far I haven't had any luck, so, you know. Mode button is right in here in the ISO dial, and that basically lets you go from manual, aperture priority, shutter priority. And again, this is default and obviously useful. Autofocus on, which is on the back, I have set to be autofocus on. So everything we set earlier in the autofocus menu, it works that way. So what that means is that by default, I'm moving the point with the joystick, all that, and then it'll activate the autofocus with that autofocus on button. And I'll get to the two things I have set up probably in the autofocus video. But anyways, and then this, the smart controller, is the autofocus on button on this camera and the 1DX Mark III. They're the only cameras that have had it yet. Has an infrared sensor on it. And so basically while moving your thumb on the button, it will move your autofocus point. If you're not have the highest dexterity, that might not be awesome. So you might want to turn this off or turn it on. One nice thing that's new is you can now have it turned to move the autofocus point, but only when metering's engaged, which is kind of nice that if you know, if the camera's been sitting for a little bit, it won't move it the second you touch it. But inevitably, once you touch the autofocus point with your thumb, then it's gonna, you know, enable it. But I have had a little bit better luck with having it on during metering. It feels like it gets bumped incidentally a little less. So the star button, I have set to metering and now autofocus start as well. However, in here, you can set it to a bunch of different things. If you hit the info button, you can then adjust the way in which the autofocus is turned on. So what I have is this check mark on the left is whether or not this thing to the right is enabled, if that makes sense. So basically like autofocus area, Doesn't matter what this says on the menu right now because it's not checked. So the only two settings I have changed is that I want it to start in the position in which I have the autofocus set to. So if I move my point over to the right, it's going to start over there. But basically all this is doing is ignoring the subject tracking. So by default, when I use the AF on button, if I have the focus point here at the chest and I got subject tracking on and there's obviously a head above that, the camera will go from here and it'll jump to this face, which is obviously awesome, right? However, sometimes situations are complicated and it will say, oh, you're trying to focus on this, but there's a face right here, and it'll go jump on this person's face who might be behind the person. That's the biggest problem I've had with this camera over the last few weeks, is that it's like almost too smart for its own good. So by disabling that subject tracking, by just going over one button, say when there's a running back with the football, and I have the focus point right on his chest, it'll focus right on that chest and be totally great. Versus the first game I did not have this set up, and it would kind of like, oh, there's a guy chasing him, and like, you know, maybe that face is a little more clear, that head's a little more obvious to the subject tracking, and it would jump to that person's head. So anyways, so I have it set to AF, and if you hit info, you can access these, and I just have this checked on, and then checked on, and then over here in subject tracking, I have it turned off. Obviously, this is super powerful. You could set up a fully custom whatever you want that star button to do. The AF point selection button, I have it set as AF point selection. I could see maybe this gets repurposed for the eye autofocus button, because I don't change my autofocus point selection a lot. Depth of field preview button, I almost never use depth of field preview, but right now I just haven't found anything to put there, if I'm honest. I think what's going to end up happening is I'm going to change the depth of field preview button to the eye control on or off, and then the selection to be eye autofocus, or maybe the record button. This whole eye control autofocus is super complex, hasn't worked for me yet, but also it's like you have to turn on eye control and then enable the eye control to move the autofocus point, and then like use an autofocus mode that's using that, if that all makes sense. I had it working once, and it's like, for most things I'm doing, just moving the point works great. Anyways, I digress. Lens function button. This is only applies to super telephoto lenses that have a button. I could have it set to metering and AF start, or it doesn't matter. I never hit that button, so I don't really use it. The set button I have changed to exposure compensation. When this is really great is if you're using manual mode in an auto ISO, you can then override your exposure compensation really easily. So this way you just hold in that set button on the back dial and then turn your front control dial to adjust your exposure compensation. This last one, direct autofocus point selection, just like the other cameras, I basically have this so the joystick will move the autofocus point. So I can either use the AF on thing, or I can use the joystick. Sometimes the joystick's better, sometimes it's easier, but most importantly, sometimes you're wearing gloves. And if you're wearing gloves, that infrared does not work. So it's nice to have both. Over on the video side, I doubt I changed anything at all. And again, because I don't really shoot video on this camera. Going to menu 5, smart controller is set to on and enable. This is that infrared, device on the autofocus on button. Vertical shooting controls are on, so if you turn the camera sideways, you want to use them. Menu 6, the audio compression is a video setting, and that's for audio recorded during video. I turn the compression off if I ever were to record video on this. Even though the audio might be not really that great out of this camera versus like a audio recorder or a video recorder or anything like that. Obviously, if I want this, I want the best quality audio I can get. Always want the best quality audio you can get. And the last thing on this menu is the release shutter without lens. I turn this on because if you're using like a vintage lens that's adapted, or if you're using one of these cheap manual focus lenses or anything like that, they don't talk to the camera. So if this is set to off, which is the default, then if there's no communication between the lens, it won't fire. So one of the cool things about RF camera bodies and other mirrorless camera bodies is that you can adapt old glass to it. So, you know, like I have like an old, you know, Canon, 135 FD or FL lens here that's from a Canon AE1, and I'm able to use it on this camera, which is pretty cool. In menu 7, I'm not touching anything here, and menu 8's to clear it. My custom menu, I just basically kind of add some things that are things I use quite often. Obviously the shutter mode's one I'm going to change a lot, going from electronic to mechanical if I'm using strobes or doing studio photography, something I do a fair amount, so that's an easy thing to change. Display simulation, again, going back to this, it's kind of more complicated than I thought when I originally set it up, so this might need to be changed. But I did leave that in there for the same reason, that if I was doing studio stuff, I could turn off the exposure simulation. Record function and card folder. This is something I change so that sometimes I got to do JPEGs to one card and RAWs to another if I'm working an event with an editor. Formatting the card, and then volume, which is where you access that shutter sound and all that. So I hope you found this video helpful. The R3 has been an amazing camera so far. Been out for 2 months now, I guess. I actually turned down my pre-order at first. They were like, your pre-order's in, and I was really uncertain about this camera. I have the 1DX3, and that was like the camera I had and the camera I wanted, and you know, why would I go to this mirrorless camera? But I pre-ordered them, and I've been pleasantly surprised. So I'm actually transitioning to all R3s and R5. The RF lenses, like this 85 1.2, which has been my new addiction, are absolutely incredible. Would really love to dive into this camera and do a walk around with it with my buddy and do like more of a formal review. But hope this helps. If you're watching all the way to the end here, please share this video on any user groups or anything that might help out. I actually talked to a company recently about reviewing some products, and they told me flat out that I did not get enough views to get the product to review it. So that does help if you're sharing them and, you know, liking and commenting, and help me out getting more, you know, the wheels turning, so to speak. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.